future survivors of the apocalypse. We're coming to you from my living room during all this nastiness that's going down. I wanted to do a video that talked about using large diaphragm condenser microphones to record. I think it's a really it's not often talked about with electric guitars, and I think it's sort of a hidden secret of the recording world. There's a lot of famous records that have used them, and I think the most notable example would be AC/DC. Pretty much most of their albums, there's Solo Dallas has a really good resource where he lists the gear used to record those albums, but a lot of the time it's a Neumann U67 microphone and a U87 microphone, so both on each cab for each young brother. And it's interesting to note that the U67 has an adjustable polar pattern on it. So what you can do is you can either make it supercardioid or omnidirectional, or just cardioid. And it's pretty handy because you can get a lot of different sounds out of it. I think the main use for electric guitar would be putting it in omnidirectional mode, and what that does is it actually records sound in 360 degrees. It's not like a SM57 where it has a really narrow beam that it records in. So if you put it a few inches off the cab, which I'll have some B-roll showing how I've got my cab set up right now, it can capture a lot of the depth of the room. So I should also mention that before we get started, Connor's probably not going to do a whole lot of talking.
Here's the thing. I really don't know a whole lot about it. All I've done as far as recording was take an SM57 or, just a couple basic mics and mic it up.
Yep. So you're going to be doing most of the demoing today. Yes. I'll have you play. Yeah. He's like the person on The Price is Right, the girl that walks around and
displays the items.
Yes.
That's basically what I am sonically.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll at some point during the video I'll kind of show the different patterns on my microphone, and for reference, what I'm using is a Mojave Audio MA300. It's a tube large diaphragm condenser microphone, and if you guys aren't familiar with that company, it was started by David Royer, and they're all really high quality microphones. I'm not sponsored by them, but it's what I'm using, and it's about the closest you can get to a U67 without having to pay $2 or $3 grand or even $6 grand.
Ridiculous amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah, the MA300 retails for like $1,300, I think, which is like the same price as a 121, the Royer 121, which is like what everyone uses these days. But yeah, so the way that I run it is in omnidirectional mode, and I have it about 6 to 8 inches off the cab, and it really gets some convincing sounds that sound a lot like those classic records. A lot of people that would have used that same mic would have been like Alan Parsons. So for pretty much all of his stuff was large diaphragm condenser, and then the stuff that he did for Pink Floyd. So a lot of David Gilmour's tones come off of a large diaphragm condenser. It's interesting to note that there was a shift from using large diaphragm condensers in like the 60s and mid 70s to using like dynamic microphones like SM57s or what would have predated those at the time would have been the Unidyne 57s, which looks the same as a 57. It just has like the chrome casing to it, and it's a little brighter sounding, but it's pretty much the same mic. So I think what contributed to that was more aggressive and higher gain guitar tones.
More gain.
Yeah. So because you notice as you get to the late 70s, early 80s, and then mid 80s, late 80s, the guitar tones get more aggressive. And the 57 definitely lends itself to that. It's got that really nasally peak to it, and a really common setup for using that is like a SM57 and then a Sennheiser MD421. And they're really great tones. I like them. I've recorded several albums using that mic setup, but ultimately my favorite tones, like I think one of the biggest sounds I've ever heard would be AC/DC, like Back in Black album. Like that whole album is just gigantic. And they did it with just 2 mics on each cab. I mean, like for people like that's pretty conservative, I'd say, for some of the setups that got up into the 80s. Like there's a picture of like Zakk Wylde's rig when he recorded his first album with Ozzy, and there's like 10 microphones on the cabs, and so he's got like 3 or 4 cabs set up in a line, and then they've just got microphones at different distances and stuff. But like AC/DC managed to sound bigger, only using 4 microphones, really. Granted, those microphones are $6,000 a piece, but
well, if you add up all those other mics that Zakk had too, I mean, it could it could be closing on that price range.
Yeah. But it's kind of an interesting concept to record like that, because I used to use like a lot of dynamic mics and stuff to record, and use different setups and stuff. Like I'd use different mics to record acoustic guitars and stuff, but now I record like literally everything with this one mic. I record acoustic guitar with the large diaphragm, electric guitar, vocals, anything I can with it. So to demonstrate, here's the difference between just a 57 and the large diaphragm condenser. I'll have Connor play a riff, and then I'll just A/B in post between the 2 microphones. So it's same amplifier, same cab. You've seen the B-roll that has both mics with their placement. And it's important to note that I tried to do just like the most common SM57 miking with it. I put it in between the dust cap and the cone, and have it off axis a little bit. So that's a really common miking technique. And then the large diaphragm condenser is pointed pretty much right on the cone, but it's backed off about 8 inches. So Connor, if you go ahead, we'll do just some crunch stuff. Yeah, so what you guys will hear, which we're not hearing right now because we only have one feed, is that the SM57 obviously has a narrower frequency response, as well as that sort of characteristic nasal peak, I think around like 1200 hertz or something like that. And it's definitely 2 different flavors. Like obviously the large diaphragm condenser is a bit more subdued sounding. It's a lot more even of a frequency response. And you can kind of sculpt it as you go. You could, if you have something that has an adjustable polar pattern like I have, you could go towards the cardioid pattern, which might give you some more bass and some more highs to it. And also it increases the proximity effect. It just kind of really goes for the sound. It depends on the sound that you're going for with it. And also, it allows you to use a lot less gain. That's why these days I think a lot of people use a large diaphragm condenser on clean amps. That's the most common use that you hear about. Pedal steel is a big example of that, where they'll use just a large diaphragm condenser on a really, really clean amp. And you can get some really good sounding results like that. Like here, Connor, I'll switch over to the Fender Twin preamp.
Okay.
Yeah, so as you can see, it has a lot of depth to it, and if you're trying to get a lot of depth out of clean guitars, because I think it is kind of hard to record clean guitars, especially with all the peaks that are in there. You kind of want to have as like level as a recording setup as you can with it.
Because you wind up getting this. It's just, I don't know. It's hard to describe. It's a weird sterile sound. Like, you know what I mean. You want it to sound nice and organic and full and as acoustic as possible. Basically, if you're going like really clean.
Yeah.
And acoustic guitars don't have those weird jagged spikes in frequency.
Yeah. Using a compressor also can help a lot with that. It really depends on how you want to use it. When I record clean guitars, on my setup here, I've got the Fender Twin preamp, but I've got a compressor pedal that's on all the time. But using compression in post, there's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on the sound that you want. The compressor I use is an optical one, so I kind of like the sound of the optical one. It colors it a little bit and makes it sound really nice. But yeah, so you don't necessarily have to get any gear to get that kind of sound. But yeah, I guess if you want to play a little more on the clean channel, I'll A/B between the 57 and the large diaphragm condenser. Yeah, so hopefully that kind of illustrates what I'm talking about, how it really smooths everything out. Another instance of using large diaphragm condensers would be Jimmy Page. One of my favorite sounds of his would be
all of them.
Well, yeah, all of them. It's really hard to tell, honestly, which songs on which albums use one. But there's photographic proof on the Live at Earl's Court. It's 1975, and I'll put some pictures up that I have where he's got a Unidyne 57 along with, it looks like some kind of Neumann. It's either a U87 or a U67, I don't know. And there's no written evidence of what mics he definitively used, so it's up to anyone's guess. But the diaphragms on a U67 and 87 are very similar, so you can get really close results with that. But a sort of a characteristic of his sound off of that live show is that it's got a lot of depth to it. It's very 3D sounding. Yeah, it sounds very similar to the AC/DC guitars, in my opinion. A lot less gain, but
same feel though. It's like the same or sort of spectrum tonally.
Yeah, it has a really unique characteristic, and if you listen for it, I'll point out some songs that have it that sound like it to me. So like Ballroom Blitz, the guitar that's specifically in the right speaker, I believe, is a large diaphragm condenser, because it has that really, really smooth sound to it. And then Maybe I'm Amazed by Paul McCartney, I believe that on the studio version of that, that's a large diaphragm condenser, because that guitar has a very, very similar sound to that. So once you kind of start comparing those and like listening to records that are known to have those microphones used on them, you start hearing it everywhere, and it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's how they got that sound, because 70s records sound so much different than 80s records, even though technologically speaking, there's not a whole lot of difference between the consoles that were used in terms of like frequency response, because they're still using transformer based consoles back then. So it's not a huge like I said, it's not a huge technological difference. And so it just came down to the mic techniques that they used, and also ultimately the production techniques. But the microphone is kind of the heart of the sound, which is always interesting. Like, and we also have plans to do a video on this where we're kind of going to use the same setup and go through a bunch of decades of sound and just change the production techniques to illustrate that point. But the gear that people were using, that the musicians were using, also didn't change that much. People were still using plexis. Like a really common amp would have been a Marshall plexi for rock and roll.
And like a Les Paul or something, or an SG.
Yeah. And yet you've got people using plexis in the 80s, and it sounds totally different than the guys what they were using in the 70s. And you can make a case for, they had modded Marshalls by the 80s and stuff, and they added...
I mean, they did, but...
But ultimately, you just have more gain. You don't really have a completely different sound. It doesn't change it doesn't change the speakers. It doesn't change the general EQ of the amp for the most part. So it's kind of an interesting thing to go back and look at. And again, AC/DC is a perfect example of that. Because they're using plexis and stuff, and I guess in Malcolm Young's case, using like a super bass, which is a plexi, but it's the first stage is a little different, and but they still
those
get
two together had the biggest sound. If you listen to the isolated tracks, there's like a Thunderstruck isolated tracks version you can find, where you can find just Malcolm's tracks and Angus's tracks.
It's the Donington show, yeah.
And my goodness, it's just
that's they were also using large diaphragm condensers there, so you can get some isolated
like sound though. And that's just one guitar at a time. But that's a good example too. Like you can really hear just how huge everything sounds, and you can also hear Brian Johnson screaming in the background a little bit.
It's so loud you can actually hear the drums coming through the pickups of the guitars. It's crazy because they have essentially like a blast chamber underneath the stage where they have like the cabs mic'd up and everything, because they don't have anything on stage, and they haven't had anything on stage. AC/DC hasn't for decades at this point. So actually, now that I think of it, we'll do one more thing. I'm gonna I'll do a riff real quick, and what I'll do is I'll edit it and switch it between omnidirectional and then the cardioid pattern, so you can kind of hear how that's going to change the EQ. Same positioning and everything. All I'm doing is just changing the polar position. So, and I'll use a Les Paul so you can get a reference of how that's going to sound, a little more common of a guitar than Connor's.
Le Kiesel.
Yeah. So as you can see, it's a pretty big difference. It's definitely a lot more bright. And where I have it mic'd, it wouldn't really demonstrate having a lot more bass, but if you have it closer to the cab, it definitely has a lot more bass to it. Just for the sake of consistency, I want to keep it at the same position, so that way you can just see like an apples to apples of how it's going to sound in one set position. And you can also certainly mess around with mic placement. If you put it closer to the cab, it's obviously going to have higher... the frequencies are going to peak differently wherever you have it. So, if you want more mid-range, you might put it closer to the cab and then put it closer to the edge of the speaker. Or if you want it to be a bit brighter, closer to the cab and then closer to the dust cap. But I've noticed that in omnidirectional mode, when you have it backed off, it doesn't really matter a whole lot about placement, because it is picking up sound in 360 degrees.
That's probably why it gets such an even response over all the frequencies.
Yeah, and so it definitely simplifies things. You know, it's just sort of set and forget. You don't really have to experiment with getting just the right placement. And it also makes things a lot easier to replicate. So if you got a sound that you really liked, you don't have to experiment for 3 hours trying to get the angle and everything just right. You just have it straight up and then, you know, right in front of the speaker. And I think that's probably why they were used so commonly for a long, long time. Especially, you know, when records were so expensive to make back then. I mean, time is money, but it was a lot more expensive back then. You know, I mean, records costing millions of dollars to make, which is like
insane.
Yeah, it's like inconceivable when people can make a Billboard 100 record for 30 grand is like what it takes these days. So, but yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with this. Like I said, we're gonna do a video that kind of goes more in depth. We're gonna use the same setup and just change production techniques to get like 4 decades of sound. We're gonna go 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s.
I don't know if we want to talk about 2000s guitar tone though. It's rough.
Butt rock.
My favorite band is Trapped, man.
All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like and comment, subscribe, all that jazz. And we'll be coming at you with another one. Thanks.